Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling to a place you would never want to visit. A time when waking up healthy in the morning meant absolutely nothing, because by sunset, you could already be dead. A century where 60% of everyone you knew simply vanished, where freedom didn't exist, where hope was a luxury no one could afford. Tonight, we're stepping into the 14th century, the absolute worst time in human history to be alive. Worse than the Stone Age, worse than the fall of Rome, worse than any war you've ever heard of. This is the story of the Black Death, of endless war, of famine, superstition, and a social order so cruel it made slavery look merciful. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm curious, where are you right now? What time is it where you're listening? Drop a comment below with your location and the time. Let's see how many of us are falling asleep to history tonight across the world. Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let me take you back to the year 1300, to a world you'll be grateful you never had to experience.
In the year 1348, a man in Florence woke up feeling perfectly healthy. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of olive trees and earth. He kissed his wife's forehead, called to his children, and stepped out into the golden fields that stretched beyond the city. The bells of Santa Maria del Fiore echoed in the distance, a familiar comfort. He took his scythe, hummed softly, and began cutting wheat under the Italian sun. For a few hours, life felt normal. The rhythm of work, the whisper of wind, the hum of bees. But by noon, a strange weakness crawled into his arms. His breath became shallow. The song on his lips faded. By mid-afternoon, he was shivering violently, even though the sun still burned overhead. By evening, dark blotches began to bloom beneath his skin, purple and black, spreading like spilled ink. His wife tried to cool his fever with wet cloths, but his pulse raced beyond her reach. As night fell, his body stiffened, and a thin trickle of blood escaped his mouth. By dawn, he was gone. His body was lifted onto a cart with dozens of others, their faces pale, their limbs twisted, their names already forgotten. The cart rolled through the empty streets, wheels creaking softly in the morning fog, toward the mass graves outside the city walls. No prayers were said, no bell was rung, there was no time. Too many bodies, too little hope. And this was just one ordinary day in what history now calls the worst time to be human. Welcome to the 14th century, the century when 60% of Europe vanished in less than 10 years. Entire towns disappeared. The smell of death replaced the scent of bread in the air. Dogs and cats turned wild, feeding on the unburied. The streets were empty except for the sound of coughing and the rolling of plague carts. And still, people woke up each morning, knowing it could be their last. This was not war. It was not famine alone. It was something deeper, something that made even hope itself afraid to show its face. It was the century when the world itself seemed to die one breath at a time. Imagine a world where life expectancy barely reached 30, where a mother gave birth 5 times, but buried 3 of her children before they could speak, where hunger wasn't a season, it was a companion. The average peasant's home was made of mud and straw, roofed with thatch that leaked in the rain. The smoke from the hearth blackened the ceilings. Rats lived in the walls. The floor was dirt, damp and cold. Families slept side by side for warmth. Privacy didn't exist. Soap didn't exist. Doctors didn't exist. Only prayers and leeches. And if you were caught stealing, even just to feed your family, you might find yourself hanging from a rope by sunrise. This was not a scene from a nightmare. This was the daily life of 90% of Europe. The church ruled the spirit, and the lords ruled the flesh. You were born to work, to obey, and to die. Freedom was a myth, a story whispered by travelers before they too disappeared. You might think the Stone Age was harder, but in the Stone Age, people could move. They could hunt, rest, or run away. In the 14th century, you belonged to the land, chained by law, faith, and hunger. And still, people endured. They laughed, they prayed, they sang songs of harvest and saints. They believed that their suffering would be rewarded in heaven. Yet heaven must have seemed very far away. Every sound, the creak of a door, the cry of a child, the rustle of wind, carried the echo of fear. For in this world, hope was not a virtue, it was a risk. To hope was to invite disappointment. To believe was to invite loss. The people of the 14th century did not dream of happiness. They prayed only for survival. The 14th century was a perfect storm, the collision of every nightmare humanity could imagine. Famine struck first. Between 1315 and 1317, rains drowned Europe's crops. Wheat rotted in the fields. Rivers overflowed. Millions starved. Then came the Little Ice Age. Cold summers, early winters,
frozen rivers. Livestock died. Families ate bark, roots, and even the bodies of those who perished before them. Then came war, the 100 Years' War, fought between England and France, devouring generations. Fields were burned, villages pillaged, men slaughtered. And then, when people thought the worst was over, the Black Death arrived. The plague moved like a whisper through ports and villages, carried by rats and fleas, by traders and priests. Within months, it erased entire cities. 75 to 200 million people died, an unimaginable number. Bodies piled in streets. Rivers ran dark with death. The air itself felt poisoned. Faith shattered. Priests fled. Parents abandoned their children. Brothers left brothers to rot. The world collapsed not in fire, but in silence. And when it was over, those who survived were not grateful. They were empty. Social order dissolved. Kings lost power. Churches lost believers. Nature turned cruel. Humanity turned against itself. The 14th century was not merely a historical period. It was a mirror. It showed how fragile civilization truly is. Strip away comfort, medicine, faith, and what remains? Fear, hunger, survival. That was life. That was history. That was the worst time to be human. You wake up at 4 a.m. The world around you is pitch black. No lamp, no candle. Fire is too expensive to waste. The air bites your skin. Your breath turns white. You pull a coarse wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, but it's damp, always damp. In the rafters above your head, rats scurry, their claws scratching wood. A faint smell rises from the corner. That is your toilet, a bucket shared by everyone in the hut. You pray the frost has hardened the stench. A rooster screams somewhere beyond the mist. That's your alarm. You stand, bones cracking, and reach for your only tunic, stiff with old sweat. It hasn't been washed in weeks. No one's has. Water is too precious. Soap is a fantasy. You slip your cracked feet into shoes patched so many times they barely hold together. Outside, the world is silent except for the wind through naked trees and the coughs of other peasants waking to the same darkness. You chew a piece of yesterday's bread, hard as stone, dark as dirt. It hurts your teeth, but it's food. You drink from a wooden cup filled with cloudy water from the stream. It tastes of iron and rot, but it's all there is. A cough lingers in your chest. Everyone coughs. In this century, health is a rumor. Your day begins before sunrise and ends long after it. You will work 14 to 16 hours, plowing, cutting, hauling, sweating. Your hands are calloused like bark.
your back curved like the scythe you hold. If you slow down, the steward will notice. He may strike you with his stick. You will bow and whisper, "Forgive me," because defiance means hunger or the rope. Children work beside you. At 6 years old, a boy carries water buckets heavier than himself. A girl ties grain stalks until her fingers bleed. They do not cry. They have learned that tears change nothing. You sometimes wonder what their future will be, but you already know. It will look exactly like yours. The sky brightens, revealing the Lord's manor on the hill. Stone walls, banners fluttering. You will never go there, yet every grain you harvest belongs to that house. The land owns you, not the other way around. Taxes, tithes, and fear, those are the seasons of your life. By noon, sweat soaks your tunic despite the cold. You wipe your face with a sleeve crusted in dirt. Lunch is thin porridge, boiled from moldy barley. Sometimes a scrap of salted meat, gray, smelling of decay, is thrown in. You eat quickly. Flies land on the bowl. No one complains. Complaints are for the dead. Afternoon drags into evening. The wind sharpens. You keep working because the overseer watches. Your hands ache. Your stomach churns. But you keep moving. When the church bells finally ring dusk, it feels like mercy. You limp back to your hut under a sky the color of ash. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and human breath. Your wife mends clothes by firelight, one candle for the week. Children sleep on straw, coughing softly. You share a bowl of watery soup. The rats return to their corners. The bucket in the corner fills again. Outside, wolves howl. You close your eyes and whisper a prayer, not for happiness, just that tomorrow you might wake up at all.
Hygiene in this world is a privilege of saints or fools. The wealthy might bathe once or twice a year, a ceremony more of pride than cleanliness. The poor, never. Their skin is layered with soot, sweat, and disease. Lice live in their hair like snow in winter. Fleas crawl freely between clothes and skin. People scratch until blood seeps. The smell of humanity is everywhere, rancid, sour, alive. Teeth rot by 20. Mouths reek of decay. No toothbrush exists. Even priests chew herbs to mask the stench. Soap made from animal fat and ashes is costly. To wash is to waste, and yet the filth hides warmth. To scrape it away invites the cold. So people keep it like a second skin, a grim kind of protection. Clothing is never truly clean. Laundry means carrying buckets of frozen water, beating garments on stones, hanging them in smoke to dry. Most never bother. They sleep, eat, and labor in the same rags until they disintegrate. Beneath each tunic lives a colony of insects, a crawling, biting reminder that you are never alone. Meals are an ordeal. Bread is black, dense, and hard enough to break teeth. Gruel boils endlessly over a smoky fire, grain mixed with water, sometimes flavored with mold. Meat is rare and dangerous, salted until gray or half-rotten. If it smells, you eat it quickly before it walks away. The river provides water, but it is also the city's sewer. Dead animals float beside washing women. Sometimes a human body drifts by. People drink anyway. Thirst kills faster than fear. Work defines existence. Dawn to dusk, 14 to 16 hours bent over fields, digging, sowing, cutting. Hands blister, nails crack. The back becomes a permanent curve. You pause only when the overseer looks elsewhere. A strike from his cane is common. Mercy is not. You have no holidays except the Sabbath, and even then the chores wait. Rest is a rumor. Children are laborers, not learners. At 6, they herd animals or spin wool until fingers bleed. Their laughter fades before their first winter. The elderly, if they live that long, are burdens. There are no doctors, no pensions, no comfort, only prayer. And prayer is currency. The church trades forgiveness for coin. Night arrives without ceremony. Darkness fills every corner. The hut is crowded, air thick with breath and smoke. You lie beside your family, shoulder to shoulder, the same lice crawling from one to another. Outside, dogs bark, owls cry. The cold presses through the walls. Tomorrow will come. It always does. And when it does, you will rise again at 4 a.m. in the same darkness to live the same day. In this place, time is not measured by clocks, but by suffering. The 14th century does not let you dream. It merely allows you to survive long enough to witness another dawn that feels identical to the last.
Picture a pyramid built not from stone, but from human lives. At the top, a handful of nobles dine on silver plates. At the bottom, millions bend their backs in the mud. That is feudalism. In the 14th century, more than 90% of Europe's people were peasants, bound to the soil as tightly as roots to earth. They were called serfs, which meant they could not leave, could not choose, could not own. A man was born a peasant and died a peasant. His children inherited not his dreams, but his chains. Freedom was not a right. It was a rumor whispered in taverns by travelers no one believed. The Lord's land stretched farther than the eye could see. You worked it, but it was never yours. Each season you sowed seed, prayed for sun, and reaped grain only to hand most of it away. 50, sometimes 70% of every harvest went to the manor on the hill. The rest fed your family, barely.
and even that could be taken by taxes you never agreed to pay. The marriage tax when your daughter wed, the birth tax when your child arrived, the death tax when your father was buried. Even grief had a price. 3 days each week you worked for free, plowing the Lord's private fields, fixing his fences, repairing his roads. If the steward said the quota wasn't met, he could beat you in front of your neighbors. The humiliation was as public as it was ordinary. And if he resisted, your family paid the cost. An extra tithe, a lost ration, a lesson in obedience. There were no weekends, no vacations, no relief, only Sunday Mass, a single morning when labor paused, not for rest, but for confession. You knelt on cold stone, whispered your sins, and begged for mercy that rarely came. The priest reminded you that obedience pleased God. The noble reminded you that disobedience displeased him. Between the two, your soul belonged to heaven, but your body belonged to the soil. Literacy was forbidden luxury. 95% of peasants could not read, and those who tried were suspected of witchcraft. Words were power, and power belonged to the church and the crown. So knowledge became another form of land, inherited by the few, fenced off from the many. Law was not justice, it was hierarchy carved in flesh. Steal a loaf of bread, lose a hand. Speak rudely to a noble, lose your life. There were no lawyers, no defense, no appeal. The judge was the Lord himself. His word was iron, his sentence divine. Torture was considered proof. If you screamed, you were guilty. If you stayed silent, you were guilty too. The rack creaked, the whip sang, and the crowd watched because they had no choice. Fear kept order better than faith ever could. Yet the system endured for centuries because it worked for those at the top. The lords grew fat on the labor of the many. The church grew rich on the fear of the poor. And the poor learned the one lesson that kept them alive. Never question, never hope, never stop working.
By design, the law served power, not people. The courtroom was a field, the judge a sword. Justice was what the noble declared it to be. When a peasant stole bread, his hand was nailed to the village gate for all to see, a warning carved in flesh. When someone insulted a noble, he was dragged to the square and hung before sunset. Bodies swung above the crowd like scarecrows of obedience. Trials were rare, torture was routine. The wheel stretched limbs until they snapped. The rack dislocated joints one by one. Iron clamps branded cheeks with letters of shame. Confession, no matter how forced, was counted as truth. Pain was the language of authority, and everyone learned to speak it. There were no lawyers, no juries, no written laws for commoners to read. Everything existed by memory and fear. Even the churchyard was divided. Nobles buried under marble, peasants under mud.
The message was clear. Inequality was not a flaw of society, it was its foundation. The church preached humility, but lived in gold. Bishops dined on wine, while peasants tithed their last grain. The Pope ruled from Rome, his palace brighter than any king's. Heaven, they said, would reward the obedient. Hell awaited the questioning. So the people obeyed. They bowed to priests who sold forgiveness, to nobles who sold protection, to kings who sold promises. All of it built on the same currency, fear. Education was forbidden because knowledge breeds doubt, and doubt weakens control. A peasant who could read might ask why the Bible spoke of mercy while the world knew only cruelty. So the church locked books away. The few who read taught in secret, risking fire and rope. Illiteracy kept the world quiet, a silence mistaken for peace. Women bore double chains. They worked beside men in the fields, then served them at home. They could not own land, could not testify, could not refuse. Their worth was measured in dowries and childbirth. If a noble desired a bride, the church blessed it. If a peasant woman resisted, the whip reminded her of her place. Generation after generation, this system repeated itself like a hymn no one dared to stop singing. Even when the Black Death came and wiped half the population, the lords claimed it was God's punishment, not their own greed. Peasants buried their families and returned to work. The world did not change because those who could change it had no reason to. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, something stirred, a quiet realization that suffering was not divine, but man-made. The 14th century would end, as all centuries do, but the scars it carved into the idea of justice, they would take ages to fade.
October 1347. The sea was calm when 12 ships appeared on the horizon near the Sicilian port of Messina. They came from Crimea, heavy with trade, grain, cloth, spices. The townspeople gathered along the docks, expecting treasures, news, and stories from distant lands. But when the ships drew closer, silence fell. The smell reached them first, a rot thick as tar, carried by the wind. Then they saw. The decks were covered in bodies. Men lay twisted in grotesque shapes, their skin darkened to the color of ink. The few who were still alive stumbled like ghosts, bleeding from their mouths, eyes hollow and wild. The harbor guards shouted orders, the crowd screamed. The city council demanded the ships be sent away immediately, but the sailors who could move begged for water. The priests raised their crosses. No one dared to approach. The ships were pushed back to sea, but the plague had already arrived.
Rats ran down the mooring ropes into the city's warehouses. Fleas dropped into the straw and grain. Within days, dock workers fell ill. Within a week, hundreds of citizens began to show the same strange swellings, the same black patches on their skin. By the end of the month, 1/3 of Messina was dead. Families locked themselves in houses, praying the doors would keep the sickness out. Bells rang without rest. Coffins ran out. People began burying their loved ones in gardens, in alleys, wherever the ground was soft enough to dig. The streets filled with the sound of weeping and the rattle of death carts. From Messina, the pestilence spread like fire carried by the wind. Ships fleeing the island brought it to mainland Italy. By winter, it had reached Genoa and Venice, the great trading cities, filled with merchants and travelers from every corner of the known world. Within 3 months, it swept across Italy like a tide that spared no harbor. 6 months later, it reached France and Spain. Within 3 years, it covered all of Europe. No kingdom was spared. From the icy fjords of Norway to the sunlit hills of Portugal, from the streets of Paris to the farms of Hungary, death moved silently but relentlessly. Priests called it the wrath of God. Doctors called it corrupted air. No one understood that it rode on the backs of rats and the bite of a flea. Everywhere ports closed, cities barricaded themselves, villages disappeared overnight. Ships floated empty at sea, crews dead, flags still waving. Letters from Venice spoke of corpses piled like wood. In France, entire monasteries were left silent. In England, farmers left their plows in the fields and never returned. The Black Death had no borders, no mercy, no cure. It moved faster than armies, deadlier than war. Within 3 years, it had swallowed the continent, leaving behind only smoke, silence, and a fear that the world itself had reached its end.
It began with a whisper, a faint chill beneath the skin, a heaviness behind the eyes. Then, without warning, the fever came. It burned through the body like fire trapped in flesh. Within hours, you would tremble uncontrollably. Sweat soaked your clothes. Your pulse raced like a drumbeat of panic. No matter how cold the air was, you felt as if your blood were boiling. Then came the swellings, buboes, the doctors called them. They appeared first beneath the arms, then along the neck, then between the thighs. Soft at first, then hard, pulsing, growing, until they were the size of an egg. To touch them was agony. To see them was terror. The skin around them turned red, then purple, then black. These were the marks of the Black Death, the signature of something that devoured the body from within. You could smell the sickness before you saw it. It carried a sweet, rotting odor, like fruit left too long in the sun.
The air around the infected became thick, heavy, foul. People crossed the street to avoid you. Even family members kept their distance, covering their mouths with cloth. In those days, to cough was to confess your death. The illness moved quickly, mercilessly. On the first day, the fever rose. On the second, the buboes burst, leaking dark, foul blood. On the third, the body began to fail. The skin blotched, turning dark at the fingertips and toes. The lips blackened, the eyes sank. The breath grew shallow and wet, as though drowning without water. By the fourth day, most could no longer stand. By the fifth, they were gone. The Black Death offered no mercy. There were no cures, no remedies, no prayers that worked. The doctors, dressed in long robes and bird-like masks, carried herbs in their beaks, rosemary, sage, lavender, believing they could cleanse the air. They could not. They poked the swollen buboes with knives, thinking to release the poison, but the poison was already everywhere. They burned incense in homes, sprinkled vinegar on floors, prayed for wind to carry the corruption away. Nothing changed. The plague had already claimed the air itself. Some believed it was spread by bad smells, others by divine punishment. Some thought it came from foreign lands, from Jews, from traitors, from sinners. Fear became the second plague, and it spread even faster. Villages hunted their own neighbors. Strangers were stoned in the streets. The healthy barricaded themselves inside their homes, sealing windows with wax and straw. But death slipped through cracks, through wood, through breath. Those who fell ill begged for water, for prayer, for touch. But no one came. Priests refused to enter plague houses. Even mothers turned away from their dying children, whispering apologies through the door. In a world without cure, compassion itself became a luxury. The dying often lay alone in dark rooms, hearing the tolling of bells in the distance. Their minds drifted between fever and fear, between memories of light and the certainty of night. In those final hours, the body betrayed them completely, shaking, bleeding, suffocating. And then silence. To live during the Black Death was to watch the world turn black, not just on the skin, but in the soul. Every town echoed with the same story: a neighbor coughing, a friend falling, a family disappearing. Hope itself began to rot.
When the plague spread beyond control, society began to unravel. At first, people believed the sickness would pass, a punishment, perhaps, for sins that could be prayed away. But the prayers went unanswered. The bells rang endlessly, tolling for the dead, until even the sound of faith became unbearable. Doctors refused to visit the sick. Priests stopped giving last rites. Neighbors stopped knocking on each other's doors.
The invisible line between the living and the dead grew thinner each day, until no one dared to cross it. In cities like Florence, Siena, and Paris, entire families vanished within a week. Houses stood locked, food rotted inside, dogs howled in empty streets, the air smelled of smoke and decay, the scent of humanity dissolving. Men and women abandoned their children, not from cruelty, but from terror. They believed that to love was to die. Parents sealed their doors, leaving sons and daughters to their fate. Wives fled from husbands. Brothers refused to bury brothers. In some places, the only people brave enough to collect bodies were criminals, paid in gold that would never be spent. The corpses piled up faster than anyone could bury them. At first, priests led funerals, chanting hymns over the graves. But as the numbers grew, the ceremonies stopped. There were too many bodies, too few hands. Coffins ran out, then wood ran out, then hope. People dug trenches in the fields, in churchyards, in marketplaces. The dead were thrown in by the hundreds, covered with lime and dirt. No names, no prayers, only the sound of shovels. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it in Florence, wrote of what he saw. They died like beasts. No one wept. No one prayed. The bodies were dragged from homes and piled in the streets like garbage. His words were not exaggeration. Florence lost 60% of its people in less than a year. The social fabric, the invisible web that holds civilization together, simply tore apart. Trade stopped, courts closed, schools emptied. Even kings and nobles retreated to their fortresses, leaving cities to fend for themselves. Thieves looted homes of the dead. Soldiers deserted their posts. Without law, fear became the only ruler. In Paris, corpses floated down the Seine. In London, so many died that graveyards overflowed. The city built new pits outside its walls, vast craters filled with thousands of bodies. The stench could be smelled for miles. And yet people still believed it would pass, that God would spare them if they repented. They fasted, whipped themselves in the streets, walked barefoot in processions, begging forgiveness for a sin they could not name. The flagellants they were called, men who beat their own backs bloody in the hope that suffering would save them. But the plague did not care. It took the holy and the wicked alike. Soon, money lost meaning. Gold could not buy health, and silver could not bribe death. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Farmers left their crops. Ships sat empty in harbors, rats still aboard. The world had no master, no order, no faith, only the endless rhythm of death. And yet, amid the ruin, there were moments of impossible tenderness. A daughter sitting beside her mother, refusing to leave. A priest who chose to stay, blessing the dying one by one, until he too fell silent. They were few, but they existed. Tiny flickers of humanity in the endless dark. By the end of it, Europe was not just half empty, it was hollow. The people who survived were not the same as those who had lived before. They had seen what happens when fear replaces love, when faith collapses, when civilization forgets its own soul. And in the silence that followed, no one was sure if the world could ever be whole again.
In the end, words were not enough to describe what had happened. Only numbers remained, cold, merciless, impossible to comprehend. In 1347, the population of Europe stood at roughly 75 million. By 1353, barely 50 million remained. 25 million lives erased in 6 short years. A third of a continent gone. But in some places, it was far worse. Florence lost 60% of its people. The city that once hummed with laughter and trade became a graveyard of silence. Venice, the queen of the sea, saw its canals filled not with songs and sails, but with funeral boats. Paris, half empty. London, gasping. Villages in the countryside vanished completely, their names forgotten, their fields reclaimed by weeds. Travelers told of ghost towns where doors hung open, tables still set, as if the owners had simply stepped out and never returned. Across the Alps, Germany and Austria suffered the same fate. In the north, the cities of Norway and Sweden froze under plague and famine. In the east, Poland and Bohemia buried their dead in frozen soil. The maps of Europe themselves began to fade. So many settlements wiped away that chroniclers could no longer record them all. What remained were not cities, but wounds. The numbers meant more than death. They meant collapse. With so few hands left to work, harvests failed. Fields lay fallow. Mills stopped turning. Food became scarce. Prices soared. Those who survived the plague now faced hunger and despair. Livestock roamed untended through empty villages. Wolves returned to the outskirts of towns, hunting in places where children once played. Nature itself began to reclaim the world that man had abandoned. Churches, once crowded, stood empty. Bells rusted silent. The faith that had once united Europe faltered. Many began to question everything: the priests, the kings, even God. Some believed the world was ending. Others believed it already had. The apocalypse had not come from the sky, but from the ground,
from the bite of a flea, from the whisper of breath, from the invisible hand of chance. Yet for every number written in the records, there was a face, a name, a life, a farmer who never came home, a mother who buried her child and then lay beside her, a priest who blessed the dying until he too fell still. These were not statistics, they were stories. 25 million stories, all ending the same way. And the Black Death did not end there. It returned again and again every decade or two, each wave smaller than the last, but always cruel. It haunted Europe for nearly 300 years, a ghost that never stopped knocking. Even when it was gone, its shadow remained. The fear of touch, the mistrust of strangers, the memory of how fragile life could be. But from ruin came change. With fewer people, labor became valuable. Peasants demanded wages. Some gained freedom. The old order, the feudal system that had ruled for centuries, began to crack. The church, once unquestioned, faced doubt. Medicine, science, and curiosity rose from the ashes of despair. The Renaissance would come, born from the grave of the Middle Ages. Still, the echo of that dark century never fully faded. It lingers in our words, in the phrase plague, in our fear of contagion, in our rituals of cleanliness and distance. The 14th century was not just the worst time to be human. It was the moment when humanity was tested and barely survived. When historians write of it, they often end with numbers: 75 million, 50 million, 25 million dead. But the truth cannot be measured in arithmetic. The truth is silence. The silence that follows the last toll of the bell. The silence that falls over empty fields where no one sings. That was the 14th century, the time when the world stopped breathing, the time when even death seemed tired.
As if the Black Death had not been cruel enough, another shadow rose over Europe, not of disease, but of men. In the year 1337, the kingdoms of England and France began a conflict that would last 116 years. A war that would shape nations, destroy millions of lives, and blur the line between duty and madness. It started, as great tragedies often do, with pride. King Edward III of England looked across the Channel and saw a throne he believed was his. His mother, Isabella of France, was daughter of a French king, and through her, Edward claimed the right to rule France. But the French nobles refused to accept an English monarch. They crowned their own king, Philip VI. And so began a war that would consume generations. But kings did not die in the mud. Peasants did. The crowns sat safely on their heads while the fields burned. Armies marched not against castles alone, but against villages, the homes of the voiceless. Soldiers from both sides trampled through the countryside, taking everything they saw. They looted barns, burned crops, slaughtered livestock.
What they could not carry, they destroyed. The English used what they called the scorched earth tactic, burning every village, every storehouse, every field that could feed their enemies. It was not about victory, it was about hunger. To starve a nation was faster than to fight it. Entire provinces were left barren. The soil turned to ash. Rivers ran black with soot and blood. And the people, the ones who did not fight, who never chose a side, suffered most. They fled into forests, caves, mountains, anywhere soldiers might not find them. But there was no safety. Armies hunted food like animals. To them, a sack of grain was worth more than a human life. Imagine a farmer in Normandy, waking to the sound of hooves. He rushes outside to see flames rising over his fields. Soldiers laugh as they torch his harvest, the work of a year gone in seconds. His wife clutches their children, their cow is taken, their house is burned. The soldiers move on. They don't even remember his face. Tomorrow they'll do the same to another village. This was not a war of heroes. It was a war of hunger, taxes, and fear. While the kings argued over crowns, their people starved beneath them. It was said that the sky over France was never free of smoke, not from chimneys, but from burning towns. The 100 Years' War was not a single battle, but a long fever. Every few years a new campaign began. Armies would march, fight, withdraw, and leave only ashes behind. Towns were rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. The land never had time to heal. Children born during one invasion would be old enough to die in the next. And through it all, both nations believed they were fighting for honor. But honor fed no one. Glory could not warm a child's body in winter. The real cost of the war was not written in treaties, but in hunger, in the empty fields, in the graves without names, in the echoes of footsteps that never returned. By the time the first decade ended, the people of Europe began to understand something terrible. There would be no peace, not in their lifetimes. The war had become a storm that no king could stop, because it had ceased to be about thrones. It had become a way of life, a cycle of violence feeding on itself, swallowing hope, one village at a time.
Imagine you are a farmer living near the border of England and France. You have never seen a king, never heard a general's speech. You do not care who sits on a distant throne. All you want is to till your land, raise your children, and make it through the winter. But the war does not care what you want. Every few years, soldiers arrive, sometimes wearing the Red Cross of England, sometimes the fleur-de-lis of France, and it makes no difference. They all take. When you hear the drums in the distance, you have minutes to act. You grab what food you can, drive the livestock into the woods, and pray the soldiers pass by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they do not. When they come, they burn everything they cannot eat or carry. They rip the doors from your home for firewood.
They take your tools, your oxen, your grain. And when you protest, they call you a traitor. You are beaten or worse. Then the army of the other side comes, weeks or months later, and accuses you of helping the enemy. They demand food, money, information. You have none of it, but they do not believe you. They drag you into the square, torture you until you confess to something you never did, and then leave your body hanging as a warning. You cannot win. You cannot even survive with dignity. Women bore the heaviest burden. They worked the fields by day and locked their doors by night, praying no soldier would break them down. But doors were only wood, and desperation was stronger than wood. Stories spread of soldiers who took everything: food, gold, and women, leaving behind only ashes and silence. Children hid under beds or in wells, clutching each other as hoofbeats thundered past their homes. The scorched earth was not just a tactic, it was a way of life. After each invasion, survivors crept back from the forests to rebuild what was left, patching roofs, sowing what little seed remained, burying the dead whose names they no longer remembered. And just as life began to take root again, another army came, another torch, another round of screams. This cycle repeated for generations. The famine that followed was inevitable. Fields lay fallow for years. Mills were burned. Irrigation channels destroyed. Food grew scarce. Bread, when it could be found, was black and hard, made from bark and weeds. People boiled leather shoes for soup. Mothers starved so their children could live another day. And still the soldiers came. Disease followed hunger. With bodies unburied and rivers polluted, sickness spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, plague, names whispered like curses. Every season brought a new kind of suffering. Priests stopped visiting villages. The churches were empty except for the dead. By the mid-14th century, the population of France fell from 17 million to barely 12 million. Entire provinces were erased. Thousands of villages vanished from the maps. What famine did not take, war burned. What war did not destroy, disease finished. For those who lived through it, there was no word for peace, only pauses between disasters. You wake each morning to the same sound: wind blowing through ruined houses, crows circling the sky. The air smells of ash. The rivers are quiet. You wonder if the world will ever end, or if this endless war is the end itself. For the kings and nobles, the 100 Years' War was a tale of strategy, alliances, and legacy. For the people, it was a century of fear, hunger, and silence, a time when living was merely a slower way of dying. War, even when distant, always finds a way to reach the poor. For kings, it was a matter of prestige, of flags and titles. For peasants, it was another mouth to feed, one that devoured everything. The longer the war dragged on, the more gold it demanded. But gold does not grow on trees or rise from the soil. It comes from the hands of the working poor, scraped from their harvests, torn from their homes. To fund the endless campaigns, kings raised taxes again and again. Each year, the collectors returned, their ledgers fat, their faces cold. They demanded more grain, more livestock, more silver. When the peasants pleaded that there was nothing left, the taxmen laughed. "Then sell your children," they said, "for the king must have his war." By the middle of the century, a French peasant might surrender 80 to 90% of his harvest to lords, clergy, and crown. The rest could barely keep his family alive. The granaries were empty before winter, and hunger settled like a second army, one that conquered without swords. Children died quietly in corners. The elderly faded away in sleep. The living became gaunt, their eyes hollow, their skin stretched tight across bone. In some villages, desperation crossed the line into horror. Chronicles speak of people boiling grass, eating bark, even flesh. There were whispers of families who, trapped by famine, did the unthinkable to survive another day. Better shame than the grave, some said. But for many, there was no choice left at all. And still, the kings wanted more. Castles had to be rebuilt, armies fed, mercenaries paid. Every victory required another tax. Every defeat demanded two. When revolts broke out, as they often did, they were crushed without mercy. Peasants armed with sticks and pitchforks were cut down by knights in shining armor. Their homes were burned as punishment. Rebellion, said the nobles, is sin against God's order. It was not just food or gold that war consumed. It devoured spirit. People stopped believing in justice, in mercy, in tomorrow. The church, once their refuge, became another collector of dues. Priests preached patience from gilded pulpits, their bellies full while their flock starved. The more people suffered, the more they were told that suffering was holy. In England, war taxes crushed the farmers until entire counties sank into ruin. In France, the countryside turned into a wasteland. Roads vanished beneath weeds, towns shrank to ruins. The population fell not just from battle, but from exhaustion. Even those who survived no longer truly lived. They endured, like trees stripped of bark, waiting for the next frost. A traveler in 14th century France once wrote, "The land itself seems weary of man." And indeed it was. Villages stood empty, churches silent, wolves howled where choirs once sang. The war had not only taken lives, it had taken meaning. In the royal courts, nobles still danced, feasted, and toasted their campaigns.
But the people outside those walls had forgotten what celebration felt like. Bread, laughter, music, all were memories of another age. The only thing that grew was grief. By the time the war entered its 8th decade, Europe was a continent of ghosts, fields haunted by the hungry, towns haunted by the dead. And the kings, blind to the misery below, still demanded tribute, still built cathedrals, still promised glory. But glory had become a lie whispered to the starving.
The cruelest thing about the 100 Years' War was not the blood, nor the hunger, nor even the plague that followed it. It was the fact that it never truly ended. It simply changed shape, like a storm that moves from one valley to another, leaving behind ashes and grief before beginning again. For the common people, war became the weather. It was something you lived under, not something you could stop. Children were born into the sound of drums and died before ever hearing silence. The idea of peace turned into a fairy tale, something priests spoke of on Sundays, but no one had ever seen. A child born in 1340 grew up hearing stories of English raids. By the time he became a father, his own son was drafted into the same war. When he became a grandfather, his village was burned again, this time by a new army, fighting for the same kings under different names. And when he died, the war was still not over. 3 generations, and still the swords had not rested. Imagine growing up where every field hides a grave. Every church bell tolls, not for one funeral, but for hundreds. The scars of war were carved not only on the land, but on the soul of Europe itself. People forgot what it meant to trust. When strangers came, they locked their doors. When they saw smoke on the horizon, they prepared to run. Even the seasons seemed crueler, as if the earth itself had grown tired of man. The armies that once fought for crowns turned into bands of mercenaries, soldiers with no home, no loyalty, only hunger. They roamed the countryside between battles, killing and stealing for food. Villages that survived the official war were destroyed by these wanderers. It was as if peace had become more dangerous than war itself. And yet, despite all the suffering, the kings did not stop. They could not. Pride had chained them as tightly as peasants were chained to the soil. Each side wanted victory, not for survival, but for vengeance. Even when truces were signed, they never lasted. Words meant nothing when honor was at stake. A monk in Paris wrote in 1412, "It has been 75 years since the war began, and no one remembers why. The young fight because they were born into it. The old pray to die before seeing another campaign." In England, taxes kept rising. In France, the land kept burning. Crops rotted, trade collapsed, families vanished. And yet somehow life continued, not with hope, but with habit. People married, tilled the soil, prayed for mercy, knowing mercy never came.
An entire century of despair shaped the European mind. Out of it came cynicism, fear, and a strange resilience, the kind born from endless pain. Those who lived through it became harder, quieter, and wary of joy, because joy was dangerous. Joy could be taken away. When the war finally ended in 1453, there was no celebrations, no fireworks, no parades. There was only silence. A silence so deep it frightened those who had survived. They had forgotten how to live without the sound of war. The fields lay empty. The churches echoed with ghosts. The children played among ruins, not realizing that their toys were broken swords and rusted helmets. Peace, when it came, was not a gift. It was an unfamiliar stranger, one that the world no longer knew how to welcome.
Around the year 1300, something subtle began to shift in the air. For centuries, Europe had lived through what historians now call the medieval warm period, a time when crops grew tall, vineyards reached as far north as England, and winters were mild enough for life to flourish. But then, the warmth began to fade. The skies changed. The sun seemed weaker, and no one understood why. The summers grew shorter, the winters longer. Rivers that once carried trade froze solid. Snow fell where no snow had fallen in living memory. It was the beginning of what we now call the Little Ice Age, a slow, merciless cooling that would last for nearly 5 centuries. It began quietly, but by 1315, the silence was broken by the sound of rain. At first, it was welcome. After all, rain meant growth. Farmers smiled, believing it would bring a good harvest. But the rain didn't stop. It fell through spring. It fell through summer. It fell through autumn. It fell until the fields were no longer soil, but swamp. The seeds that had been planted rotted in the ground. The grain that had been stored began to mold. Livestock starved in their stalls because there was no dry hay left, and the rain kept falling. In the chronicles of the time, monks wrote that the heavens wept without ceasing. Rivers overflowed, bridges collapsed, roads turned to mud so deep that wagons disappeared in it. The sky stayed gray for months. No one had ever seen anything like it. The climate had changed, and with it, the entire balance of life in Europe. By the end of that year, the harvest had failed. By the next year, it failed again. Entire regions were underwater. In England, the Thames rose so high that it flooded parts of London. In France, fields of wheat were reduced to black sludge. In Germany and Flanders, farmers abandoned their land, wandering from town to town in search of food. The price of grain soared, not by 10% or even 100%. It increased 8-fold.
A loaf of bread that once cost a single coin now cost 8, and for many, there were no coins to spare. By 1316, hunger had turned to panic. Townspeople accused merchants of hoarding food. Merchants accused peasants of lying about their stores. Mothers stole from their neighbors. Brothers fought brothers over a handful of grain. This was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one of the first great disasters of the Little Ice Age, and perhaps the most terrifying, because it struck not with swords, but with silence. Rain fell for nearly 2 years. Crops failed across Europe. It is estimated that up to 90% of the harvest was lost in some regions. In a single winter, tens of thousands starved. Children were found dead beside their mothers. Whole villages disappeared. And still the people prayed. They filled the churches, lighting candles in the damp air, begging for the sun to return. But the candles went out as the rain dripped through the roofs. The skies did not listen. Historians today know that a complex mix of factors caused the Little Ice Age. Volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean currents, and reduced solar activity. But to the people then, there was only one explanation: God's anger. They believed humanity had sinned, that greed, war, and pride had offended heaven, and so the skies had turned against them. The rain, they said, was not water, it was punishment.
Imagine this. You have survived war. You have survived plague. And now the sky itself has turned against you. The year is 1316. It has rained for months. The ground is mud. The air smells of rot. The rivers are brown with decay. Your home is damp. Your stomach empty. Your hope gone. At first, the hunger is dull. It gnaws quietly, a soft pain in the belly. You tell yourself it will pass. You eat your bread slowly, piece by piece. You count the sacks of grain, calculating how long they will last. But the rain keeps falling. The food spoils. The math becomes meaningless. When the stored food is gone, you eat the livestock. The cows that once pulled your plow are slaughtered. The chickens that once gave you eggs become soup. The dogs and cats that once warmed your children's feet are gone too. The nights grow colder. The cries of hunger echo through the village like prayers that no one answers. Then you eat the seed grain, the one thing meant for next year. You know it means no harvest later. You know it means death postponed, not escaped. But hunger makes the future impossible to care about. There is only the now, the ache, the emptiness, the slow fading of strength. Soon, even the seed grain is gone. You boil grass, you chew bark, you dig roots out of frozen ground, you eat moss from the stones. Anything that fills the mouth, even
if it poisons the blood. And when nothing else remains, history records what comes next. In the annals of Europe, there are stories written by trembling hands of mothers who smothered their infants because they could no longer feed them, of fathers who dug up freshly buried corpses in the night, of travelers who vanished on the road, never seen again. There are accounts, whispered, censored, half-believed, of cannibalism. A monk in St. Albans wrote, "People ate dogs, horses, and the flesh of those who had already died. Some were accused of murdering children for food." Another chronicle from Flanders described mothers who ate the flesh of their own sons and then wept. It is easy from centuries away to judge them, but hunger does not respect morality. When the body starves, the mind begins to dissolve. Love turns into instinct. Morality becomes memory. Survival is no longer a choice, it is a reflex. And still, the rain fell. The churches filled with the weak and dying. Priests preached repentance, but even their voices trembled with fear. Bread became more valuable than gold. A single onion could buy a life. Some fled the cities, seeking food in the countryside. Others fled the countryside, believing cities had more. But everywhere was the same. Famine had no borders. It crossed kingdoms, languages, faiths. It made beggars of all men. The chroniclers said that 1 in 10 died. Others said more. In truth, no one knows. What is known is this: those who survived were changed forever. Their eyes lost warmth. Their laughter disappeared. They never wasted a crumb of bread again. In the years that followed, even when the rain finally stopped and the fields began to dry, something inside Europe remained broken. The famine had not just starved the body, it had starved the soul.
The Great Famine did not end with the rain. When the clouds finally parted, they revealed a land that was no longer the same, and a people who were no longer the same. It wasn't only the crops that had died. It was trust, community, and faith itself. For 2 years, Europe had eaten itself alive, and when the hunger passed, the survivors looked at each other differently. Neighbor no longer trusted neighbor. The priest no longer comforted his flock. The fields were not just empty of wheat, they were empty of hope. Those who had once worked side by side in harvest now avoided each other. In many villages, people whispered about what had happened during the worst months. Who had stolen, who had killed, who had eaten what should never have been eaten. There were no trials, no confessions, only silence, a collective guilt that hung in the air heavier than the mist. The famine had taken more than 1 in 10 lives across northern Europe, but its real toll was invisible, the collapse of strength. After years of malnutrition, immune systems weakened. Wounds festered. Children born during and after the famine were smaller, frailer, and often did not survive infancy.
The generation that came after was a generation already dying. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, the world was already prepared for death. The famine had softened it, hollowed it, made it ready. Bodies that once might have resisted infection simply could not fight anymore. The plague swept through Europe like a wind through dry leaves, because hunger had already done the burning. Economically, the famine shattered stability. Farmers lost their livestock and their seed grain. It would take years to rebuild, but the weather had changed. The shorter summers, longer winters, and unpredictable storms made farming itself a gamble. Every harvest season became a prayer, every meal a small victory. The church, once the unshakable pillar of society, suffered too. People had prayed for deliverance, and heaven had remained silent. Priests spoke of divine punishment, but their words rang hollow. For the first time in centuries, people began to wonder if God had turned his face away, or if he had ever been watching at all. That question would echo for generations. And yet, in the quiet that followed, something unexpected began to grow. From despair came a strange clarity. The famine had stripped humanity to its bones, and from that rawness came reflection. People began to question why suffering was so unevenly shared, why nobles feasted while peasants starved, why the powerful claimed divine favor while the poor buried their children. These questions did not fade. They simmered slowly across decades and would one day erupt in revolts, reforms, and the rethinking of everything sacred. The seeds of change were sown in the ashes of hunger. Even the art and literature of later centuries carried its shadow. Pain became beauty. Tragedy became wisdom. Europe would never again be innocent. In the centuries to come, historians would mark the Great Famine as the first great warning, a whisper before the scream of the Black Death, a mirror showing what happens when nature, pride, and ignorance collide. For those who lived it, there was no philosophy, only the memory of rain, the ache of emptiness, and the silence of fields that once sang with life. They did not know it, but the famine had changed history forever. Before the Black Death, the church was the beating heart of Europe. It was more than a religion. It was the air people breathed, the rhythm of every day. Bells marked the hours of work and rest. Priests defined what was right, what was sin, what was hope. The church was the light, the law, and the comfort in a world where life was short and death was always near. Every man, woman, and child believed, not because they were forced to, but because faith was the only thing that made sense. When a child died, the priest said, "God has taken them to heaven." When the harvest failed, God is testing your patience. When war came, God will reward you in the afterlife. There was an answer for everything, and for centuries, that answer worked. But then came the plague. When the Black Death struck in 1347, the priests said, "Pray, and God will protect you." People did. They prayed, they confessed, they fasted. They lit candles until the churches glowed like stars. But nothing changed. The disease came anyway. The pious died first. The priests who blessed the dying soon followed. Monasteries became graveyards. Entire orders of monks vanished. Bishops, abbots, and cardinals all fell to the same invisible enemy. Even the Pope himself, Clement VI, hid in Avignon, surrounded by fires, believing the flames would purify the air. By the time the plague had passed, 40 to 50% of all clergy were dead. Those who survived were either lucky or careful. The church, desperate to fill the empty pulpits, began to recruit anyone who could read Latin and stand upright. Untrained, uneducated, often corrupt, these new priests lacked the wisdom or discipline of their predecessors. Corruption spread like a second plague. Priests sold indulgences, promising forgiveness for a price. Bishops fought over land and wealth. Monks drank, gambled, and grew fat, while their flock starved. The church that once preached humility now looked more like a kingdom of greed. And the people saw it. They asked questions that no one dared to ask before. If God is merciful, why did he let the innocent die? If priests are his servants, why are they richer than kings? If heaven exists, why does the earth look like hell? The church had no answers. For centuries, it was the bridge between man and God. But after the Black Death, that bridge cracked. People no longer trusted prayers. They began to seek meaning elsewhere, in nature, in reason, in themselves. The seeds of doubt, once planted, began to grow. Some turned to mysticism, searching for personal visions of the divine. Others turned away from faith entirely. The world had changed, and the old words no longer worked. By the late 1300s, churches were emptier. Confessionals were silent. The fear of sin no longer outweighed the fear of starvation. People no longer saw the priest as a guide, but as a tax collector in robes. The church, once untouchable, eternal, divine, was bleeding authority. And in the shadows of its decay, something new began to stir. The idea that man could seek truth without the permission of God's gatekeepers.
In the years after the Black Death began, the air of Europe was filled with more than the stench of death. It was filled with fear. The church had no answers. The priests were dead. The doctors were helpless.
And so the people turned to the only thing left, pain. They believed that the plague was not random, not natural, but divine punishment, a cleansing fire from heaven to burn away human sin. If the church could not save them, perhaps they could save themselves, not through prayer, not through confession, but through suffering. And so the flagellants were born. They appeared first in Germany around the year 1348, then spread like wildfire through Flanders, Bohemia, Poland, and even into Italy. They came in groups, sometimes 50, sometimes hundreds, barefoot, wearing rough robes, faces hidden beneath hoods. They walked from town to town, chanting hymns that sounded more like cries of despair than songs of faith. And when they reached the town square, they began their ritual. The drums beat slowly, thump, thump, thump. The crowd gathered in silence, and then, one by one, they stripped off their tunics. In their hands were whips, leather thongs tipped with iron spikes. They raised them high and struck their own backs again and again until the air was thick with the sound of flesh tearing. Blood ran down their spines, mixing with dirt and sweat. They chanted as they whipped, crying out, "Kyrie eleison," Lord, have mercy. Some fainted from pain. Others smiled through tears, believing each lash brought them closer to forgiveness. They called themselves the Brethren of the Cross. For 33.5 days, the age of Christ, they would march, pray, and bleed, then move on to the next town. Children watched in horror. Mothers wept. Priests protested, calling them heretics. But the people no longer listened to the church. They listened to the sound of pain. At first, towns welcomed them. People believed that the flagellants could drive away the plague, that their suffering could appease God's wrath. Even some joined them. But the plague did not stop. The death bells kept ringing. The corpses kept piling up. And then something darker happened. The flagellants began to see themselves as chosen, holier than priests, closer to God. They claimed that their blood was sacred, their suffering divine. They refused to obey the Pope. In many towns, they became violent, attacking clergy, burning churches, accusing anyone who doubted them of sin. Their processions grew frenzied. The line between faith and madness disappeared. Eventually, the Pope condemned them. In 1349, a papal decree declared the flagellant movement heretical. Many were arrested. Others vanished into the mountains, continuing their rituals in secret. But their image, the line of bleeding men walking barefoot through the rain, chanting in the name of salvation, never left the European imagination.
It was the portrait of an age that had lost its balance, when faith had turned into fear and redemption into self-destruction.
When people cannot find answers, they look for someone to blame. And in the 14th century, when the Black Death swept through Europe, taking millions of lives, that search for blame became an inferno. The plague moved silently. It spared no one, rich or poor, priest or beggar. It killed the innocent and the sinful alike, and that made it terrifying. People needed a reason, something, someone to explain why their world had turned to ash. Rumors began in the markets, whispered in fear. The Jews, they said, have poisoned the wells. It made no sense, but fear does not need sense. It only needs direction. The story spread like the plague itself. Across France, Germany, and Switzerland, people claimed to have found evidence, jars of strange powder, letters between Jewish merchants, confessions extracted under torture. And once the rumor was believed, there was no stopping what came next. In hundreds of towns, mobs formed. Bells rang, not for prayer, but for vengeance. The same people who once bought bread from Jewish bakers, borrowed money from Jewish lenders, and called them neighbors, now dragged them from their homes. In Strasbourg, in February of 1349, the city gathered its Jewish population, about 2,000 men, women, and children. They were locked in a wooden enclosure near the square. Then, without trial, without evidence, they were set on fire. The smoke rose for hours. Those who refused to burn were forced to convert to Christianity. The rest were ashes on the wind. And Strasbourg was not alone. Mainz, Cologne, Erfurt, Basel, city after city followed. In many places, entire Jewish communities were erased in a single day. In some regions, not one Jewish family survived. The irony, the tragedy, was that Jews were dying from the plague too. They suffered the same fevers, the same blackened skin, the same fear. But fear needs simplicity, and the Jews poisoned the wells was simple enough for the desperate to believe. Some rulers tried to stop the massacres. Pope Clement VI issued a decree declaring the Jews innocent. He wrote, "The plague is a punishment from God, not the work of man." But his words were carried away by the wind. The mobs no longer listened to Rome. They listened only to their rage. It is said that in some towns, Jews killed their own families to spare them from torture. Others set fire to their homes rather than face the mob. Mothers held their children close as the flames rose, whispering prayers in Hebrew, the last songs those streets would ever hear. By the time the frenzy ended, tens of thousands of Jews were dead.
Entire communities that had existed for centuries, scholars, merchants, rabbis, children, were gone. Europe's landscape of faith had gained another scar, one carved not by plague or hunger, but by hatred. And when the ashes settled, no miracle came. The plague continued, untouched. The wells were as they had always been. The real poison had never been in the water. It had been in the human heart.
When the Black Death ended, Europe was not reborn. It was broken, emptied of half its people, its faith shattered, its fields abandoned. But in that ruin, something unexpected began to stir. For the first time, the powerless realized they were not as powerless as they had been told. The plague had killed 1 in 3. That meant fewer workers, fewer farmers, fewer hands to till the soil. The land still needed tending. The castles still needed food. But there were not enough peasants left to serve. And suddenly, for the first time in history, the poor had leverage. They asked for more pay. They demanded shorter hours, better treatment, freedom to leave the land. If we die, they said, you will starve. But the lords, proud and frightened, refused. They believed hierarchy was sacred, that the order of master and servant had been written by God Himself. To question it was to sin. But hunger makes bold men. In England, in 1381, it began with taxes. The war with France had drained the treasury, and the crown demanded more. A new poll tax was imposed, a payment for every man, woman, and child, no matter how poor. For many, it was the breaking point. The peasants gathered in villages, armed not with swords, but with scythes, axes, and farm tools. Their anger burned hotter than any army's fire. They marched under banners of faith and justice, shouting, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" A reminder that all men were born equal before God. Led by a man named Wat Tyler, tens of thousands of rebels marched toward London. They stormed castles, burned tax records, and executed corrupt officials. For a brief moment, the earth trembled. The peasants, long bowed, now stood tall. In France, the story was the same. In 1358, the Jacquerie uprising erupted. Villagers, sick of endless war and hunger, turned on their masters. They burned manors, tore down estates, and shouted that the age of tyranny was ending. Across Europe, similar revolts flared in Flanders, Italy, and the German states. Each one sparked by the same truth: people had suffered too much for too long. But the world was not ready to change. The nobles struck back with cruelty that shocked even chroniclers. In England, Wat Tyler was killed during a peace meeting. In France, The jacquerie was crushed within weeks, tens of thousands slaughtered. The lords reclaimed their thrones with blood, and the message was clear: obedience or death. Yet something irreversible had happened. The peasants had tasted their own power. They had learned that the world could tremble when they moved together. Even in defeat, their defiance echoed. Over time, laws began to shift. Wages rose. Serfdom, the system that bound men to land, began to fade. The seeds of freedom had been planted in blood. It would take centuries for those seeds to bloom fully, in revolutions, in reformations, in the birth of democracy itself. But they began here, in the mud and smoke of the 14th century, when men who had nothing dared to believe they deserved more. And that belief, fragile, dangerous, forbidden, was the beginning of everything.
The 14th century was, by all measures, the worst time to be alive. A century of plague, war, famine, and despair. Yet from its ashes, the modern world began to take shape. Fragile, uncertain, but undeniably new. Sometimes it is not peace or comfort that moves humanity forward, but catastrophe. The Black Death had killed too many. Entire villages vanished. Cities fell silent, and families disappeared overnight. But in the aftermath of death came something unexpected: opportunity. There were fewer people to farm the land, fewer to labor, fewer to serve. For the first time, labor became precious. The survivors, once voiceless, found their worth rising with every passing year. A peasant could now ask for wages. A craftsman could demand better conditions. And though the lords resisted with all their might, they could not resist the math of mortality. There were simply not enough living hands to keep the old world standing. Slowly, the chains of serfdom loosened. Fields were rented, not bound by birth. Men began to move freely, seeking better lives, better masters, or no masters at all. Feudalism, the system that had defined Europe for nearly 1,000 years, began to crack. It did not collapse overnight, but its foundation, the idea that some were born to rule and others to serve, was shaken. The Great Pyramid of medieval society had lost its base. The church, too, faced its reckoning. Before the plague, it had promised protection, salvation, and order. But when the Black Death came, priests died as quickly as peasants. Prayers went unanswered. The faithful looked to heaven and saw silence. Half the clergy perished. Those who replaced them were often uneducated, unprepared, and corrupted by power. The church, once the soul of Europe, became a shadow of itself. From this collapse rose doubt, and with doubt came thought. Men began to question. If the church could be wrong, if divine order could fail, then
Perhaps truth did not belong to priests alone. Perhaps it was something to be sought, tested, proven. Centuries later, that seed of skepticism would bloom into the Reformation, and beyond that, into the Enlightenment itself. Meanwhile, the endless wars, especially the 100 Years' War between England and France, did something no king had planned. They created nations. Before, people served lords or local dukes. After, they began to see themselves as part of something larger. English, French, not just villagers or vassals. The idea of nationhood, born from pain, replaced the idea of ownership. And through it all, something else began to change, quietly, invisibly. People started to rediscover beauty. After so much death, life itself became sacred. Artists painted not just saints, but people. Writers began to tell stories not only of heaven, but of the human heart. Architects looked at cathedrals and wondered if stone could hold light instead of fear. By the end of the 14th century, a new word was whispered in Italy: Rinascita, rebirth, the Renaissance. It was not an explosion. It was a candle relit in the dark, passed from mind to mind, from Florence to Rome, to Paris, to London. The fire that would illuminate the modern world was kindled in the ruins of the old one. The 14th century had tried to destroy humanity. Instead, it remade it. Every death, every tear, every prayer unanswered became the soil from which our civilization grew.
When we look back at the 14th century, it feels like staring into a nightmare, a time when death walked openly in the streets, when fear was a neighbor and hope was a memory. And yet, that was the world our ancestors survived. So, when you wake up tomorrow and scroll through your phone, when you complain about slow Wi-Fi, traffic, or the price of coffee, pause for a moment. You are not living in the 14th century. You are living in the safest, healthiest, and most comfortable era humanity has ever known. Imagine this comparison. In 1348, 1 out of every 3 people you knew would vanish within a year, entire families gone overnight. Today, a simple vaccine can protect you from diseases that once wiped out continents. You have antibiotics, clean water, hospitals, doctors who don't flee at the sight of sickness, but stay to heal. In the 14th century, war was not a news headline. It was the air people breathed. The 100 Years' War lasted longer than an entire human lifetime. Villages burned, generations lost. Today, though conflicts still exist, most of us will live and die in peace. Our wars are mostly fought on screens, not battlefields. Back then, hunger was a shadow that followed everyone. A few months of rain could destroy a year's harvest. People ate bark, grass, and sometimes each other. Now, you can walk into a supermarket and find fruit from the other side of the planet. Food is so abundant
that our challenge isn't scarcity, it's waste. In the 14th century, knowledge was forbidden fruit. 95% of people could not read. Books were chained in monasteries, guarded like treasure. Today, every answer you seek lies within reach, in your pocket, glowing behind a screen. The wisdom that once took a lifetime to find now comes in seconds. Back then, people were bound by birth. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. Freedom was a dream. Choice was a sin. Today, you can become whoever you choose to be. You can travel, speak, create, love freely. You can build a life shaped not by your bloodline, but by your decisions. Every modern frustration you face, a bad day, a broken plan, an argument online, is a privilege of survival, a sign that you live in a world safe enough to worry about small things. So the next time you feel trapped, hopeless, or powerless, remember this: you are the descendant of those who endured the worst century in human history and lived. You come from survivors, from builders, from those who faced death every day and still planted seeds for tomorrow. You live in the dream they never saw.
The 14th century was humanity's trial by fire. A century that seemed determined to erase us, but it didn't. And because of that, every one of us who lives today carries proof, silent, invisible proof, that human beings can survive anything. When you think about it, our ancestors faced challenges that would break most of us. They endured plagues that killed millions, wars that lasted lifetimes, famines that stripped entire nations bare. They saw the world fall apart, and yet, somehow, they kept going. They buried their children and still planted seeds for spring. They lost faith, but still built churches. They saw cities burn and still rebuilt them with their own hands. They did not have hope handed to them. They created it out of ashes, hunger, and tears. The 14th century teaches us something essential about the human spirit, that resilience is not born in peace, but in struggle, that meaning is not found in comfort, but in endurance. We often imagine progress as light defeating darkness, but maybe it's not about defeating it at all. Maybe progress is the light that refuses to go out, even when surrounded by night. Every modern convenience we have, every freedom, every law, every piece of knowledge exists because someone, centuries ago, refused to give up. They built the foundation of our world not with steel or wealth, but with persistence. The survivors of the 14th century were not heroes in armor or kings with crowns. They were ordinary people, farmers, mothers, healers, wanderers, who chose every single day to keep living when it would have been easier not to. And that quiet choice to live, to love, to rebuild, changed history.
So when your own life feels hard, when the world seems uncertain or unfair, remember them. You carry their blood, their endurance, their stubborn light. If they could face a world filled with death and still find reasons to hope, then what can't you overcome? The truth is, you are the continuation of their courage. Every breath you take is part of a story that refused to end. The 14th century tried to end humanity and failed. Because we are not a species built for despair. We are built to rebuild, to endure, to begin again. That is the legacy of the worst century to be human. Not the suffering, but the strength.
And now, here you are, lying in your warm bed, wrapped in quiet. The hum of electricity in the walls, the faint glow of a screen, the soft rhythm of your breath. Outside, the night is calm. No smoke, no screams, no bells tolling for the dead. Just silence. Gentle, ordinary silence. Close your eyes for a moment and remember what we have seen together tonight. The streets of medieval Florence, heavy with plague. The empty fields of France, burned by war. The starving families under the endless reign of the Great Famine. The peasants who dared to rise. The faith that fell, and the courage that took its place. The 14th century, humanity's darkest chapter, and yet somehow also the soil from which hope grew. You do not live there. You do not breathe that air. Your world hums with light, with comfort, with choices those people could never imagine. The tap brings clean water. The fridge hums with food. The roof does not leak. And the diseases that once ended entire cities can now be cured with a pill. You are safe. You are alive. And you carry within you the strength of every soul that walked before you. Sometimes the greatest act of remembrance is not mourning, it is gratitude. To live well is to honor those who couldn't. To sleep peacefully is to carry on the dream of those who never got the chance. The 14th century tried to destroy everything, but it also proved something unbreakable, that even when life becomes unbearable, humanity endures. That no night, no matter how endless, can stop the dawn. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, let that truth settle in your heart. You are the descendant of survivors. Your peace was paid for in centuries of pain. Your comfort was built from their struggle. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of history fall away. The wars are over. The fires have died. The bells are silent. The world for this moment is at peace. And so are you. Sleep well, traveler of time, for tonight
History rests with you.